The notice had said it plain: cook wanted, no family, and Ruth Delaney read it again as her wagon crested the last rise into Stony Draw, her 3 children lying flat and silent under the canvas behind her, because she had begged them to be still. She had folded that scrap of newsprint into her glove 3 towns back, when the last of her coin went for a sack of cornmeal, and the mule threw a shoe she could not pay to mend. Now the ranch house stood below her in the failing light, low and long against a slope of red rock, smoke leaning off the chimney, and a man was splitting wood in the yard, with the kind of hard, even rhythm that did not stop when a stranger's wagon came into view. She set the brake. She smoothed her skirt, though there was no smoothing the road out of it. Behind her, under the tarp, she felt the smallest hand find the hem of her coat and hold it. "Stay down," she whispered. "Whatever you hear, stay down till I come for you." Owen Brandt buried the axe in the block and looked at the woman climbing down off the wagon seat, and the first thing he thought was that she had come a long way to be turned around. He had run that same notice in 3 papers because he had learned the hard way what a house full of noise did to a man who wanted only to work his cattle and be left to his quiet. His hands had gone stiff over the years, his voice with them. He watched her come across the yard, travel-worn, thin at the wrist, but she walked straight, and she met his eyes and did not flinch, and that was more than most. "You'll be Mr. Brandt," she said. "I've come about the cook's place." "You've come a distance for it." "I have." She held out the folded notice, as if it were a paper of reference, which in a way it was. "Ruth Delaney. I can cook plain and cook well. I can put up preserves and mend, and keep a house clean enough to eat off the floor of it. I don't waste, I don't complain, and I rise before the birds." He took the notice, glanced at the words he himself had written, and handed it back. "It says no family." I read it. "You're alone then." The pause was small. He almost missed it. But he had spent his life reading the small pauses of skittish horses and weather about to turn, and he did not miss it. "I'm a widow," she said, which answered nothing and everything, and she held his gaze while she said it, and he found he could not fault her for the thing she had not yet told him. "Wages are $1 the week and you're board," he said. "Room off the kitchen. I take my supper at 6 and my breakfast dark. I don't talk much. Neither do I, when there's work to be done." He should have asked more. He knew it even then. But the light was going, and the woman looked as though she had not eaten a proper meal in a week, and something in him that he kept buried and did not examine turned over once, slow, like soil under a plow. "Put your mule in the near stall," he said. "There's hay. Supper's your first task if you mean to earn the $1. He walked back to his woodpile so he would not have to watch the relief come into her face, because relief on a proud woman's face was a hard thing to look at square. Ruth cooked that first supper with her heart going like a hammer. She had the children still in the wagon, and the wagon in the barn, and she fed Mr. Brandt a plate of fried potatoes and salt pork and biscuits that made him look up from his plate twice, which for a silent man was as good as applause. When he had gone out to check the stock by lantern, she carried 3 plates to the barn and fed her babies in the dark of the stall. Samuel, who was 9 and too old and too grave for 9. Ada, who was 6 and had her father's stubborn chin, and little Tom, 4, who fell asleep against a bale with grease on his cheek before he had finished chewing. "How long?" Samuel whispered. "Till he finds us." "Not long," she admitted, because she had never lied to the boy and would not start. "But we'll have eaten, and there'll be a roof over one more night, and tomorrow we'll look after tomorrow." She got them settled in the wagon bed under every blanket she owned, and she slept 2 hours out of the night on the kitchen floor by the stove, and rose in the dark to have his breakfast on before he stirred. It lasted 4 days. On the 4th night a storm came down off the rimrock, the kind that flung itself against the shutters and made the lamp gutter, and Ada woke in the cold barn frightened by the thunder, and did what any 6-year-old will do. She came running for her mother, out across the black yard, in her nightdress, crying, and she ran straight into Owen Brandt, where he stood on the porch, watching his roof and worrying his stock. He caught the child by instinct, before he had rightly understood she was a child at all, and then she was clinging to his leg and sobbing for her mama, and the kitchen door flew open, and Ruth stood there white as the flour on her hands, with the truth of her standing right there wailing against a stranger's knee. For a long moment no one spoke. The rain came sideways. Ruth crossed the porch and took her daughter up into her arms, and held her, and lifted her chin, and looked at Owen Brandt with everything already lost in her face, and only her dignity left to lose. "There are 3, she said, Samuel, Ada, and Tom. Their father died of the lung fever a year gone, and left us nothing but debt. I've been turned off 4 places for having them. The last man told me to leave the little one at a church door, and he'd take me on." Her voice did not break, and that was somehow worse. "I couldn't answer your notice honest and feed them both. So I hid them. It was a wrong thing, and I did it with my eyes open, and I'll have the wagon out by first light." Owen stood in the driving rain and looked at the woman and the shaking child, and something in his chest that had been shut a long time made a sound like ice going off a river in spring. He had married once, young, and buried her and the baby that came too early in the same week, in the same ground, 11 years back, and he had run every soul off this place since, and called it peace. He had written no family on that notice with his own hand, because a house with children in it was a house that could be emptied, and he had not thought his heart could stand to be emptied twice. He looked at little Ada's wet, dark head against her mother's neck. He looked at the barn, where 2 more of them were waiting in the cold to learn whether the world would let them stay. "Get her in out of the wet," he said, and his voice came out rough as a rasp. "And the boy, and the other one. No child of any age sleeps in my barn while I've a dry floor." He turned his face into the rain so she would not see it. "You should have told me straight. I'd not have turned you off for it." Ruth stood rooted. "The notice. I wrote the notice," he said, "when I was a fool who thought a quiet house was the same as a good one." He came down off the porch and went himself into the storm to the barn, and came back carrying Tom asleep against his shoulder, and towing Samuel by the hand, the boy stiff with distrust, ready to fight a grown man for his mother's sake, and Owen looked down at that readiness and respected it more than the boy could know. They dried the children by the stove. Ruth made cocoa from the last of a tin she had been saving for Christmas, and the 4 small faces came slowly back to warmth, and Owen Brandt sat in his own kitchen at midnight and could not for the life of him remember why he had wanted it empty. The next morning, he did not eat and leave. He sat at the head of his own table with 3 children ranged down the sides of it, and their mother at the foot, and he ate biscuits and watched Tom feed bits of his to a barn cat that had followed them in, and something settled in him, quiet, the way a foundation settles onto rock. "Boy," he said to Samuel, "you know horses?" "Some," Samuel said, wary. "You'll know them better by spring. A man earns his keep here, big or small." He said it gruff, but he saw the boy sit up an inch straighter at being called a man, at being given a place instead of asked to disappear, and he knew he had said the right thing, without quite knowing how he'd known. The weeks folded into one another. Ruth kept his house and his table, and Owen kept finding reasons to come in early. He mended the barn roof, and then, without a word of announcement, he mended the little side room and put in a second bed and a third, small one, and hung a shelf where Ada could keep the 3 smooth river stones she had begun to collect. He carved Tom a horse out of pine one night by the stove, and left it on the child's plate at breakfast, and pretended not to watch the boy find it. He walked Samuel through the near pasture at dusk, and taught him the names of the stars a working man steers by, and the boy who had been so grave began, by inches, to be 9 years old. There came a hard test of it in the 6th week. A neighbor, Harlan Voss, rode over about a strayed heifer, and stood in the yard while Ada and Tom played by the pump, and he looked them over the way a man prices stock, and he said, loud enough to carry, that he'd heard Brandt had taken in a widow with a whole brood, and that a man who'd kept himself clean of encumbrances all these years was a fool to saddle up with another man's leavings. Ruth heard it through the open kitchen window and stood very still, with a wet plate in her hands, waiting, because she had heard such things before, and knew how they ended, with a shrug, an averted eye, a man deciding the trouble was not worth it. Owen Brandt set down the halter he was mending. He walked over to Harlan Voss unhurried. And he was not a large man, but there was a stillness in him that made Voss's horse sidestep. "Those two by the pump," Owen said, quiet, "and their brother in the barn, and their mother in my kitchen, are the finest thing that ever came onto this ground. You'll not speak of them as leavings on my land, Harlan, nor off it where I hear of it. Your heifer's in my south draw. Take her and go, and come back neighborly next time, or don't come at all." He said it without heat, which was worse than heat, and Harlan Voss took his heifer and went, and Ruth stood at the window with her heart too full for the plate in her hands. That night Owen said nothing about it, and neither did she. But she put an extra spoon of sugar in his coffee, and he noticed, and they understood each other without a word, which is a thing that only happens between people who have begun, quietly, to belong to one another. And Ruth watched the hard, silent man of stony draw turn tender in the corners, where he thought no one was looking, and she felt the fear that had ridden in the wagon with her all those months begin, at last, to climb down and stay behind. It was Ada who said it out loud, the way small children say the true things the grown ones are too afraid to. It was a Sunday, and Owen had taken them all up the rimrock in the wagon to see the country green after rain, and Ada put her hand in his big scarred one as they walked and asked, "Plain as weather, are you going to be our papa now?" Ruth went still. Owen stopped on the trail. Samuel watched him with the old wariness half risen, ready to gather his mother and his sister and brother and go, the way they always went, the moment a man's face closed. Owen Brandt crouched down in the trail so his eyes were level with the little girl's, and he was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, his rough voice was gentle, as Ruth had never heard it. "If your mama will have me," he said, "I mean to be. And there's not a paper in the world, nor a notice I was fool enough to write, that could make me anything less to the four of you now." He looked up at Ruth over the child's head, and all the buried years were in his face, unburied. "I ran everybody off this place because I was afraid of losing what I lost before. And then a woman came over that rise with 3 children hid in her wagon because the world had taught her that being a family was a thing to be ashamed of. It's the bravest thing I ever saw. I'd be honored if you'd stop hiding them, Ruth. I'd be honored if you'd let me stand between the 4 of you and the world." Ruth Delaney, who had not wept in front of anyone in a year of hard roads, wept then, up on the green rimrock with the wind coming clean off the mountains. And Owen rose and put his arms around the whole shivering huddle of them, all 4, and held them the way a man holds the thing he has decided he will not let the world take from him again. They were married in the little draw church a month on, with Samuel standing up beside Owen in a mended coat, and Ada carrying wildflowers, and Tom carrying his pine horse. The notice was long gone, burned in the kitchen stove one night by Owen's own hand, while Ruth watched, the 2 of them laughing low so as not to wake the children. And on winter evenings after, when the wind came down off the rimrock and flung itself at the shutters, the way it had that first 4th night, no child of that house woke frightened in a cold barn. They woke in warm beds under a sound roof, and heard the low voices of a man and a woman at the stove, and knew, the way children know a thing in their bones long before they have words for it, that they were home and wanted, and that the hard, quiet man who had once put no family on a notice now had one, and would sooner have died than let a single one of them go.